Hello, and welcome to Belfast Iconoclast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking to Nick Dearden, who is the director of campaign group Global Justice Now, who are opening a Belfast branch of their organisation. And after that, I'm headed down towards Victoria Square to talk to the organisers of a demonstration against Apple in the week that the European Commission decided that the corporation needed to pay $13 billion to the Irish government in lost taxes. Last week, social justice campaign group Global Justice Now held an event down at the Sunflower Bar on Union Street in order to launch the Belfast branch of their organisation. I popped down to the bar to speak to the director of Global Justice Now, Nick Dearden, and find out what his hopes were for Belfast.
So we've been around for about 40 years. We used to be called the World Development Movement, and essentially we are a social justice organisation, but with a particularly global focus. So traditionally we look at social justice issues in Africa, Latin America and Asia, and we look at the impact of our governments, our institutions and our corporations on those countries. I think over the last few years it's become really evident, with the massive inequality in our own society and impoverishment in our own society, that you can't separate the developing world from the developed world, or the north and the south, whatever you want to call it. So we've become far more interested in justice everywhere, and particularly in trying to make the links. So particularly in trying to ensure that when people are working on an issue in Africa or Latin America, they're not coming to it with a sense of kind of pity or charity, but a genuine sense of solidarity. Like, we understand that through our own experience of what's happening here.
So you would say you're a transnational organisation?
Exactly, the opposite of a transnational corporation. We're an anti-corporation at a transnational level, because I think ultimately, change has to, it's a bit cliched, but it has to go from the local to the global.
You're here in Belfast. How are you going to get people to act transnationally? Because, people can only really do local activities.
People can only do local activities, and that's really important, but they can do it in solidarity with other people, and they can do it, especially, I think, some of the most important activities that people undertake are when they're undertaking activity against a corporation or an institution which is affecting people north and south, like here and somewhere else. One of the reasons transnational corporations have so much power is they're allowed to go anywhere in the world and do anything they want. Essentially, we have a system of global governance that they've built up that allows them to do that stuff. People are a little bit more stuck in their place. But one of the wonderful things about the technology that we have now, digital communications and the rest of it, is we find out about struggles elsewhere, and we can begin to globalize the resistance, if you like. We can begin to formulate pockets of resistance against the same target in different places, and that massively limits the strategy of a global corporation who thinks it can just pick up and leave and go somewhere else and treat other people somewhere else in the same way it's treated people here, and there'll be no learning between those people. So really that globalization of resistance is, I think, central to what we do. And I think that, I'm sure there are numerous struggles here in Belfast where people are facing the power of transnational corporations or the financial system or whatever it is, that are very similar to the problems people are facing elsewhere. Interestingly enough, we've done a lot of work previously in looking at the debt crisis in Europe, Greece, Spain and also Ireland, and talking to people. I remember when I was in the Republic a few years ago, talking to people in Ireland about the debt crisis, which was extremely similar to what had been faced by people in the Philippines and in Ghana and in Argentina 10 or 20 years before. And just knowing, for those people to know they weren't alone and to learn from the strategies of people who'd been through it before was a very powerful experience.
Do you find then that it's easy to get your message across, or are there unforeseen barriers that get put up in front of you?
No, look, there are a lot of barriers. We live in an age where we've all been told since, we were babies that we are first and foremost consumers. Like, the way we relate to each other in society increasingly is relating to other people through a marketplace. It's increasingly about me maximizing my own selfish needs. These ideas of how the free market's supposed to work, the invisible hand and all that Adam Smith talked about, increasingly is the way that people have been taught to believe they should interact, because that makes people better consumers, better capitalists, if you like, ripping up communities and destroying those bonds that exist outside the market, destroying aspects of the welfare state, which meant that people thought in a non-market way. So this is a real obstacle. I mean, the main obstacle we face is people's sense of disempowerment, isolation and alienation that comes from the type of society and type of economy that we have. The first question normally that you get asked is, what can I do about all of this? I think a lot of people in our society know something seriously wrong in the world. They're not happy with the massive inequality. They're not happy with climate change. Who would be? They're not happy with the way that people get treated in our communities, but they've been disempowered by this way of thinking. I often talk about this process of financialization, where everything's been taken over and run as if it was a financial market. In a way, the first problem is that our very minds have been financialized. I go to university today, I have to take out a massive debt. That means my life becomes an investment account, and I better get a good return on that debt. How do we stop people thinking about their lives as if it was an investment account, as if they were isolated little atoms trying to maximize their self-interest, to bring people together so they can be powerful? That's the main obstacle. It's there are technical issues and so on that are difficult to get across, but that's not the main problem. I mean, when we started working on the TTIP campaign that I know we're going to talk about, we were like, were people really going to get this acronym? This is a very dry subject. People had no problem with it. It was people got what this meant for themselves and their communities and their lives. The problem is convincing people they have power.
You talked a little bit about TTIP upstairs. Do you find that people are more willing to listen to this because they have greater access to knowledge, or do you think it's because they're feeling a little bit more pressure financially, economically? What do you think is the reason that people are suddenly becoming more, awake, as it were?
It's a really interesting question as to why TTIP became such a big campaign in the way that it has done. Honestly, I think some of it is luck. I think there's no magic solution to what people will pick up and run with. The nice thing, if you like, about TTIP from our perspective is because it threatens so much of what people care about in society, there's something in there for everybody. You care about the National Health Service, you care about food standards and not eating GM food, you care about controlling the banks because you've seen the damage that they can wreak on our society. Whatever it is, TTIP is a threat to our ability to do something about it. And ultimately, it's about democracy. It's not a trade agreement. And people got that much, much more easily than we would have imagined people were going to get it. I also think you're right. It's happened at a moment in our history when people have recognized this isn't just how the world's always going to be. The financial crisis woke people up, and it took a while for people to come to from the shock that they experienced, but they realized this isn't just going to continue in a stable way for the rest of our lives. Societies can change, and they can change for the worst as well as the better. And we have a duty as citizens to get involved. And so I think, in a sense, TTIP, appealing as it did to lots of different people in our society, came at the right time for people in terms of them recognizing they weren't really in control of the society that they were living in. The so-called democracies that we were living in have been seriously eroded. And if we didn't wake up and do something, things are not going to get any better. They're not going to get better on their own.
Certainly I would agree that it's during times of capitalist crisis that people become more aware that everything's not right. And so not only are we more vulnerable, but also the system is more vulnerable. What do you suggest we do? I mean, it seemed upstairs while I was listening that your organization is predominantly a lobbyist organization, that you mostly lobby politicians and organizations. Is that all you're about, or is there like an other element to this?
Yeah, no, I feel really bad now. I've given you the impression that we're a lobbying organisation because we spend so long talking about how lobbying is not the main vehicle that's going to change society. I think very often we construct our campaigns around trying to force people in power to behave in a different way. Because we recognise, of course, that our political institutions have been highly captured by corporate interests and business interests and so on. But at the end of the day, these people are supposed to be accountable to us. So if we're to take people to a place where they realise something's really wrong here, the best way to do that is to convince them that the politicians aren't representing them in the way they should, and you can do something about that. And in a way, I feel that is a more healthy way of going about it than what we were doing 15 years ago, which was talking all about corporations and people that made their trainers or their genes should be more accountable to them in some weird way than their politicians should be. But that doesn't mean that our strategy is about convincing politicians to change their minds because they've not quite understood something. I think politicians do something when they have to do it. And if enough people get engaged in an issue, mobilised in an issue, taking action in an issue, if they simply can't resist the force of popular pressure anymore, that's why they change their minds. And so, you can have postcards or whatever aimed at, or lobbying days aimed at politicians, but actually what you're trying to do is force your democratic will onto political institutions. And that's what we try and do. But I mean, I think there's something beyond that too, because I think that even in the best case, even if our system was working as well as it possibly could do, our parliamentary democracy was invented a couple of hundred years ago and is not fit for a genuinely democratic society as we would understand it today. So I think what we also hope to do is by people starting to take power, starting to change things, starting to feel, this is possible, that they will go beyond simply depending on a politician that you elect every 5 years and hopefully start to get far more involved in controlling their own economy. So the other thing I was talking about upstairs is the projects that we're a little bit involved in, which is really people starting to build democracy from the grassroots up. So whether it be about taking control of our energy system or our food system, taking that power out of the hands of corporations and trying to start in a very local way and run things differently, that's another way of people feeling empowered. And I think both things are absolutely vital. There's the big political stuff where we're trying to move people who have some power, and there's us actually recognising what our own power is and starting to take that from the grassroots up.
It's funny that you talk about the democratic will of the people and taking back power, because obviously we're now in the shade of a decision that was made a couple of months ago to leave the European Union. Typically, people view anyone who voted to leave as right-wing reactionary bigots. So even though the majority of the left was saying it's a problem to leave the EU, anyone who voted to leave must obviously be a bigot. But the radical left see something more than that. They see that, there's a definite problem with the EU. So even though it's problematic in and of itself, there's various reasons that people might want to leave. And of course you have the Lexiteers who say, it might not necessarily look like a left exit, but there are things to be gained. So what is your perspective, or what is the perspective of your organisation on Brexit, and how does it affect the work that you have to do?
Well, we started off, like a lot of people in our position who know a lot about the EU and have worked on it and seem to spend our whole lives campaigning against bad stuff the EU's doing, being in a very conflicted position. Because on one hand, the EU has been seriously captured by big business interests and so on. On the other hand, we're living in a country with a government which is one of the worst governments when it comes to pushing that corporate agenda at an EU level. And we felt very strongly, I think, and we discussed it with our membership. So we made a democratic decision on where we were going to stand on the EU referendum, and it was pretty overwhelmingly in favour of voting for Remain, but not joining the official Remain campaign, which was all about fear, which was all about trying to make the case that business won't be happy or senior politicians won't be happy if we leave the EU, and trying to say, look, there are positives about the EU. We understand that. We don't see enough of them. And that's because it's not under democratic control in the way that it should be. But if you're looking at big issues like climate change, if you're looking at big issues about how you restrain corporate power, it's difficult to see how you're going to do that at a nation-state level in today's world. So we took that position and we started campaigning on it. I think as the campaign proceeded, it got more and more difficult to understand why people thought there would be a possible left-wing opportunity coming out of a Brexit vote. But of course people still did. Some people still did. And I think there were two categories. I think there was some people who were quite ideological about it, and just ideologically, they probably have been around a long time, voted against the EU in 1975, and still have that position. And but I think I don't agree with them. But I think there are other people who have been thoroughly screwed over by globalization, by the system that we're living under, who absolutely just said it can only get better. Who feel no solidarity, who've been completely abandoned by the Labour Party and the political forces that are supposed to represent them, and just said, we've had enough, we're going to give a bloody nose to all these people in power who are telling us to vote one way. Now, I think it makes our work incredibly more difficult because, we now have one of the most right-wing governments in our history, absolutely hell-bent on rewriting our constitution in a very free trade, pro-corporate manner. And in some ways the worst of both worlds, because it's not just free trade, it's also anti-immigrant, because they see that as a way of keeping people who might be unhappy about their free trade agenda happy, because they think it was all about immigration and so on. So I think we've got seriously tough times ahead of us. And I think it's not helped by the fact that there are these very deep divisions within the left now as to why people voted Brexit and whether it was an acceptable thing to do or not. And that obviously doesn't leave us in a good position either. We have to move forward. We have no choice about that. And we have to try, I think, and mobilise some of the energy and enthusiasm from the TTIP campaign to make people recognise and realise that what this government is about to do, if left to their own devices, is going to be absolutely awful and probably the worst for some of those communities in the most heavily pro-leave areas of the country. We have to do something which can bring those people back on side and show them that there are alternative economic solutions that will work for them. And if we don't do it, Brexit gives us an inkling as to what we've got to look forward to, because, I do think there is an element of right-wing populism that's growing stronger and stronger in this country, that's growing stronger across Europe, that's growing stronger across the United States. And in all places, it's a result of leaving behind vast swathes of our population, not giving them any alternative. And so suddenly people like, multimillionaires like Donald Trump look like they're anti-establishment candidates, and they say something very seductive to those people. And really, we on the left have to get our act together, because if we don't just have, this isn't just going to continue. Neoliberalism, I think, is on its last legs. It's the current economic system is breaking down. And by the way, it can get worse. It can get worse than it is at the moment. And Donald Trump and Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen give us an inkling as to what that might look like. If we can't speak to ordinary people in our society, ordinary working class people who've been screwed by the system we're campaigning against, we're in real trouble. So it's a wake-up call to all of us, I suppose, but it's not going to be easy.
Many forces on the left say what we should do right now is join Jeremy Corbyn, join a radical Labour Party. Would your organisation be behind parliamentary politics? Are they far removed from parliamentary politics? Or do you believe there's a middle ground that people should be trying to attain?
Well, look, as an organisation, we don't endorse any one political party, and that's kind of foundational to us, because we believe that we need to influence lots of different people, and we need to work with lots of different people, and we're not going to start irritating people or marginalising people by saying we support one particular political solution. We absolutely think that the election of Jeremy Corbyn was a result of the historical compromise that was made in the 1990s by Social Democrats with neoliberalism and the leaving behind of all sorts of communities and the failure to come up with alternatives to neoliberalism. And it was a moment of hope, and of course Jeremy, we've worked with him for a long time and he supports a lot of our policies. And so from that point of view, I totally understand why people as individuals would want to join the Labour Party. But I also understand why, if you're in Scotland, you might want to join the SNP, you might want to join the Greens, there's a lot of progressive parties. And I think we're in a period now, we're not in the 1950s or 1960s where we just had the two-party system. We're in a period of time where people have different ideas about how to go about things, and that creates all sorts of different alternatives. And I actually think we've got to move to the stage where political parties get better, especially political parties on the left get better at working with one another and recognising differences, but also recognising similarities. The thing that I find most frustrating at the moment is the tribal nature, the ongoing tribal nature of party politics in Westminster. I think it's astonishing for people who aren't in Westminster as to why it still operates in this way, but it does operate in this way. And politicians have really got to wake up to the fact that unless we want a government like this for the rest of time, They have to do more to cooperate together and to collaborate together. And I think that's what their electorate wants them to do as well. So, in terms of individuals, I'm not going to recommend anybody joins any particular political party, although I think joining political parties is a completely valid and good way of influencing politics. And, certainly wouldn't put anybody off doing it. But, it's for everyone to make their own choice about how they do that.
Finally, Nick, what do you want to see happen in Belfast? You're here tonight, you're trying to get people motivated, you want them ideally to join Global Justice. Now, what do you hope for the city? What would you like to see take place?
We have not had a group in this city as long as anyone can remember. So we may have had one in the past, but no one can remember it. And so we would dearly love more activism to be going on in this part of the world. And it's just fantastic that so many people have come out on a Friday evening to hear about politics, but also hopefully to be entertained and have a drink and so on. Perhaps if there was a left-wing group here up for doing some interesting actions, up for lobbying people, up for doing some media, that could begin to break down some of that fear around that kind of taking power. So for me, having a really vibrant group here would be absolutely awesome. And also it moves the centre of our organisation away from England. I mean, we've got a little presence in Wales, we have got a presence in Scotland, but I mean, if you're a national organisation, you do not change things from an office in London. We can make the materials, we can help provide people with ideas and resources to do stuff, but ultimately change comes when people in local communities all over the place start doing stuff themselves. And I've seen it happen. I've seen politicians who would not countenance talking to us because they think we're a bunch of mad radicals sitting around in an office cooking up plans for social change, but when their constituents start doing stuff, that's when they get scared, that's when they move. And I've seen pieces of legislation pass purely because politicians understand the strength of feeling in their communities and their constituencies. So, the more places you've got that stuff going on, the more likely changes to happen. So it's great. It's great to be so far away from London, actually, and people talking about this and getting involved in this kind of stuff.
This week, the European Commission decided that Apple needed to pay $13 billion in lost taxes back to the Irish government. People have been rightly angered at the fact that the Irish government have appealed this decision, as it seems that they do not want Apple to pay these taxes. Stormont MLA Gerry Carroll organised a demonstration down at Victoria Square outside the Apple store to highlight the Irish government's decision. I headed down towards Victoria Square to see if I could catch up with the organisers and get a few words.
So we're also here today to say the call and the push to lower taxes for corporations in the north should come to an end, and companies like Apple, like Google, like Starbucks should pay their way so we can put this money into public services. Apple, pay your way.
We'll be here another day.
Apple, pay your way.
We'll be here another day.
Apple, pay your way.
We'll be here another day.
Because we've seen Apple refuse to pay their taxes in the south of Ireland for a number of years, and now when they've been told to pay, they're effectively saying no. The Irish government's supporting them on this, and in reality it's immensely unfair, the fact that corporations can get away with avoiding billions upon billions of pounds in tax year in, year out. That's money which is being robbed from our public services, from our health service, from the welfare system, etc. And we're out here today in order to send a message to these, not just Apple, but to the rest of them, that it's time to pay their fair share.
Wouldn't it be better just to write a letter to your local politician or go down south and protest outside the Dáil?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the politicians have shown that they're not going to listen. In fact, they want to reward corporations not paying tax by cutting it even further. Well, the Stormont Assembly does anyway. In the south, again, exactly the same thing. They want lower and lower corporation tax. I think protesting here today is important because Apple doesn't pay their taxes in the south, but there's plenty of other corporations who don't pay their taxes in the United Kingdom as well. And this is a solidarity action with the people in the south, but also a message to all the other corporations as well.
So can you tell me, why are you protesting outside the Apple store today?
I've come down here today basically to expose the difficulties that we're in at the minute with Apple and other multinational corporations. Apple owe the Irish government, and the Irish government are quite happy to turn their back on that. It's also exploitation of workers, so we've come over down here to expose that, give people a little bit more information about it, and get dialogue going about what we can do to change it.
Why are you out here in the Belfast Apple store?
Because it affects the whole of the island as a whole. Apple is a multinational corporation that affects us all. It's not like it's not doing it to every country that it's in, and it's not like it's not exploiting every customer and every worker that's there.
Well, Apple as a company make millions of pounds globally. We're here today to show solidarity with people the world over, not just in Dublin, but in kind of everywhere that Apple uses tax havens. Outside the store in Belfast, this isn't going to make a whole lot of a difference in the grand scheme of things, but it is an act of solidarity.
I spoke to another protester outside the Apple store asking them why they decided to protest against Apple.
Well, I think the decision of the Irish government to refuse to take this money is a reflection of the pernicious nature of Irish capitalism at the moment, that you have working class families struggling, you have people on the housing waiting lists, and we're told it's about the lack of money and resources, yet here's £13 billion that's been or $13 billion euros that have been denied that they're refusing to take. And it's quite hypocritical of the government to say that they're prepared to fight the EU on this issue. They weren't prepared to fight the EU when it came to the Troika cuts that they stood by, and they weren't prepared to fight when it came to the water charges. There is a protest at the Dáil on this Wednesday, and I think that's positive. But I think it's part of a broader trend internationally where multinational companies, not just Apple, Vodafone, other companies, get away with tax avoidance, something that the British government are also responsible for, and something that has to be challenged by an international movement.
I'm here with Gerry Carroll, who organised this protest. Gerry, what is the point of this protest? Why not go down and protest in Dublin, or why not write a letter to your local MP or MLA?
Yeah, well, we're saying that, obviously this is a decision by the Irish government to say we're going to appeal the decision made by, the ruling made by the European Commission to say that the Irish government should collect €13 billion in taxes. And we're making a point here that these corporations for too long are getting away without paying their way. If you work in the public sector, you work in the private sector, if you're a working class person, you have to pay your taxes. If you turn around and says, I'm only going to pay 0.05% in taxes, you'll be hauled in front of a court and you'll be prosecuted. So why should it be different for corporations who are earning billions on our backs? So we're here at Apple to put the pressure on them to say that the law needs to change, the politics needs to change, and we need to be putting these corporations need to be paying their way. And it's time for this scandal and effectively a daylight robbery to end. And we're also standing in solidarity with people in the south, our comrades in the south here fighting this fight as well, because it's an issue across the island in terms of corporations getting away with not paying their way.
One bystander that walked past questioned why just Apple and why not some of the other businesses that are here at Victoria Square.
Yeah, well, they should all pay their way, like, you know what I mean? I said a few words there, sort of wrapping up the protest, and said Apple, Google, you know, it's not just this rotten apple, it's the whole barrel it's stinking. You have Google, you have Starbucks, you have a lot of companies, corporations not paying their way, so we want them all to pay. We're not saying it should just be Apple, but I mean, let's be clear, it's €13 billion that should be collected, that should be paid, so that's why we're here. Austerity, we're told, is a necessity because there's no money, because there's no finance. It's all nonsense. And you see this current example, you see that there has always been money, there always is money. It's a question of having a political will to make these corporations pay up. Google, Starbucks, all these corporations which are avoiding billions, hundreds of billions of pounds in taxes every year should end the scandal and they should pay up.
Great, thanks very much for talking to us, Gerry. That's it for this week's podcast. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard in the show, please like us on Facebook. Our Facebook is facebook.com/Belfast Iconoclast, or follow us on Twitter at BFast Iconoclast, all one word. If you have any comments about anything that you've heard in the show, or you want to get in contact with us, or you'd like to weigh in with your own opinion, please send us a message at the Facebook page or on our Twitter. And thank you again for listening.